If you ever want to go back in time to find out what life was like on Sanibel 60 or 70 years ago, all you have to do is take a trip to the Sanibel Historical Village and Museum. Several of Sanibel's first homes and businesses have been moved here to give kids, and grown-ups too, an idea of what life was like on the island from 1920 to 1940.
People came here to farm. That's what both sides of my family did when they came here. That's what they did. But sometimes it wasn't enough to feed you. And then they came from, a lot of them came from Kentucky. Well, in many cases, there were people that, and I think that's partially, if not totally true of my family, that they had sort of reached the end of their rope in a way, and they're looking for a fresh start. And it was just like if people that went out west, people came down here. And my father and mother first came here, this place was a frontier. People carried guns. They walked down the street. There was no law against that. There wasn't any town. Closest neighbor, when I was growing up, we had was over a quarter of a mile. It happened to be Clarence Rutland.
The Rutland House, which is now the main museum, is a typical house that you would find on Sanibel back then. Built in 1913, it was home to Ruth and Clarence Rutland from 1928 to 1982.
Everybody loved Miss Ruth. She was a busybody in many ways and a gossiper, and like Louiser in the funny papers, she liked to listen to the telephone. Man, she got most of her gossip off the telephone. Anytime you rang the telephone and you picked it up, 9 out of 10 times you'd hear a click, and that was Miss Ruth picking up her phone, and so she could listen to the conversation. Nothing vicious about her at all. She just loved the gossip, and she had nothing to do, you know, sitting home all the time. She loved to hear the conversation. And then Miss Ruth had a pitcher pump on her back porch, and her house was very close to the road, and a lot of people would walk from wherever they were down to the store, for instance, very often. And at the time you got to Miss Ruth's house, you were thirsty. You'd go around to the back and pump up some cool water, and the water just came out of the ground, but it was surprisingly cool and very thirst-quenching. And maybe Miss Ruth wouldn't even come out, you know. You'd just pump you a pitcher full of, a label full of water, or pump it into a bucket and dip it out, and you drink your water and you go on your way.
And inside you can see a lot of very interesting antiques. In the hallway are pictures of the early pioneer families, and the science room displays artifacts of the Calusa Indians. The Calusa, which means fierce and warlike people, lived all throughout southwest Florida until about 300 years ago. They were ruled by a king. A warrior class did all the fighting, and workers provided all the food by hunting and gathering. The Calusa used shells for decorations, weapons, and tools, and also had a rich culture of art.
We played in the swamp. We went in the swamp and down and around and climbed and went through the mangroves and always looking for Indian mounds, which were supposed to be in there. We never found any, but we'd always say we'd bump in the ground was an Indian mound, but anyway. And then we'd make new trails. We'd make trails in the swamp. And we'd make tunnels and trails in the sawgrass, and you get down on your hands and knees, you part, and all the sawgrass is over the top of it, and you could make tunnels through the sawgrass.
To me, it was perfectly normal and natural. I mean, we didn't have a lot of kids around. We didn't have a lot of kids to play with. We played with what we had. Going out in the swamp and climbing around, to me, was as great as anything today. We had a barn full of mules and a lot of other mules that other people had. We used to build tents out of croaker sacks that the feed came in. And up at the schoolhouse when we were playing, we had one ball. It was roughly the shape of an egg and a few stitches missing here and there. And if you lost the ball, the game was over. So if you hit the ball over the fence playing softball, that was not a home run. You were out. And then the whole team went out and searched for the ball.
When I was about halfway through the grade school here, we had never played football. And a guy came on the aisle and he had a football. And so we started, as long as he was there, we played football. When he left, he took his football with him. So we didn't have a football, so we looked around and we noticed the shape of a coconut. And you see the shape of this coconut, why you can see that it's a similarity of a football. And it's very light. There's no milk in it, and it's dried out. Very light, and it's easy to throw, and it's easy. It's easy to catch. Would be very difficult to kick. Believe me, don't try it, particularly barefooted, which we very often played.
A short walk out the back of the Rutland House will take you to the Bailey store, the island's center of activities in the early days. The ferry boat stopped here a couple of times every day. So along with the telephone and telegraph office here, this general store was Sanibel's primary link to the mainland.
That was the heart of the island, particularly in the summertime. If you wanted to find somebody or see somebody, you could either come down to the store at 10 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And the mailboat came in at 10 o'clock in the morning from Fort Myers and came back from Captiva and went back to Fort Myers at 2 o'clock. And people, picked up things off the boat and put things on the boat going out. A lot of the people on the island were fishermen and farmers and whatever they were doing, what little tourist trade we had back in that time, you just take off and come down to the store at 10 and 2, and that's where you met people, and this was a meeting place.
We sold all the types of farming equipment, plus the fertilizer, the crate material, the seeds, the plows, wagons, wash tubs. You use those for the laundry and washing yourself too.
Next to the Bailey store, you can look at the original 1926 Ford Model T that used to be the store's delivery truck. Just behind the store is Sanibel's old post office, built in 1926 from the pieces of the original post office that was blown down by a hurricane. This was not the only time hurricanes scattered this little building, and each time it was patched back together, the boards were cut to fit, and you can see this rough carpentry on every wall. Miss Charlotta's tea room was built to be an automobile service station, but when the old Bailey store was swept into the water in the 1926 hurricane, this building was used until the new store was built.
See, I was only 6, 7, 8 years old, and it's hard to remember all the things that went. But we took that building and moved it down the road. There was a road from which is now Bailey Road down past the store and set it up. We did it with mules and telephone poles. We jacked the building up, took the underpinnings out, lowered it on telephone poles, hitched the mules to the house, and pulled the poles. And every time a pole came at the end, 4 men picked it up, took it up in front and put it back in the building until we got it to about, going the other side of the store is about 700 feet. It was probably the ideal spot on the island for where the crowd was going by. But that didn't last, but about, I don't really know, and just in the early 30s it lasted. I don't know how many years he did.
All throughout the tea room, you'll see the things that Miss Charlotta used to make cakes and goodies for the passengers waiting for the ferry. Right next door, the burnout cottage built about 1900 was used to hold Sunday services and represents the early days of traveling preachers. It also contains the original lens from the Sanibel Lighthouse. During the 20s and 30s, most people on Sanibel made their living farming, and a small garden in the center of the historical village gives a small sampling of the crops that were grown, mostly tomatoes, peppers, and grapefruit, for markets everywhere from Key West to New York City.
Sanibel was a farming community. As a matter of fact, my father came, he didn't know anything about farming, but he took up farming and was very successful at it, and went into, that's where we get our name Sanibel Packing Company. He went into packing fruit and vegetables and citrus fruit and vegetables and shipped a great many of them out here.
That was what you call today truck cropping. The biggest crop always was tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, sweet potatoes, watermelons. It was a big, and then later on my father planted a lot of citrus trees, and they worked pretty good. But the pH in the soil here is such that we had both the grapefruit and the tomato exceptional quality of the fruit.
And one of the main crops we had, which we always call them tomatoes instead of tomatoes, that was the main crop we had, was tomatoes. And we shipped a ton of those things up to New York City, and our tomatoes were so good that the people up there would label them. The grocery people would up there label them Sanibel tomatoes. And I also say Sanibel instead of Sanibel, which is the correct pronunciation. Sanibel tomatoes. And we had a real good reputation. Well, even when they didn't have our tomatoes up there, they would label them Sanibel tomatoes because that's how good a reputation we had.
Well, of course, where we are, we're right on the water, right down here, and we shipped to Key West, New Orleans, Havana, and then later, when the other boat, when they got more steamboats later on, they used to go around Florida and on up the East Coast. It was ideal. Now, as that changed, and we got roads and we got trucks, that changed it. It wasn't as easy, and the boats weren't going. The boats stopped running, but when we first started, it was just perfect. The first real disturbance was the hurricane of 21, which didn't amount to horror. Then the 26 hurricane, and then it was a slow demise from there on.
We had a hurricane back in 1898 that my father went right through and didn't bother. We had a bad hurricane in 1910 that really hurt our citrus. We had another bad hurricane in 1921. And then we had a hurricane in 1926, which destroyed our store and wiped out our packing house and everything. And we moved in out of the water up on the land where this building was built in 1927. The next bad hurricane we had, then farming started to decrease because, you see, the availability there was a lot of things that were coming into Sanibel, going out of Sanibel by boat, and when the Depression came, a lot of that was cut out. So the getting stuff in and getting stuff off the island was very difficult. So as soon as the Depression hit, the farming went way down. And then we had another hurricane in 1935, which was very bad and hurt the farming. What little farming we had then wiped out everybody but us. We still did a little after that. But the real one that, in my opinion, that just the absolute end was 1944. And that hurricane was one of the lesser hurricanes that we had as far as wind was concerned. But there was very little rain during the hurricane, and high seas, and the water came up very high, but the salt spray was devastating. There was very little rain, and the salt spray just killed. And all our citrus trees, wiped us out of citrus trees. We didn't have any more citrus trees. There wasn't a tree left, I don't think, after the 44 hurricane. And just everything on the island that was could be damaged by salt was killed.
See, when the 44 hurricane came over, most hurricanes have a lot of rain. I mean a lot, prior, during, and after. 44 hurricane came along, and the drought was very little rain during the hurricane, which was unusual, and afterwards there was none. So all that salt and all the minerals that were just the earth just sucked it all right up. And the water ground table has never been the same since.
And then the vegetation on this island just changed. The vegetation on this island now is nothing like it was. A lot of open land. Of course, there was a lot of farmland. And the island was always, and why it was in ridges. And in between these ridges was very fertile land. And it seemed to me after the '44 hurricane, why things came up that weren't the kind of shrubbery and plants and weeds that you didn't want. And of course, there was very little cultivation, so things grew that we really didn't want to grow, and just took over the areas that were farmlands. And of course now, so much development, so much of this has changed. You wouldn't recognize the island back in the '30s the way it is today. The vegetation is completely different. This village really covers my lifetime. The buildings here really start just about the time that I started, back in the early 20s. Old folks like to look at it and talk about the old days, but it gives you a first-hand information. Not only when the kids see it, then they ask questions about it. They will know what it was like back in those days, and it's so much easier to talk to children when you've got something to work with, to show them.
Well, I hope they get a sense of what it was like here before, and that we're proud of our heritage, but we don't necessarily want to go back to the days of the old pitcher pumps and the two-holer. And well, if they could realize what we didn't have to do, and you have to make do with whatever you've got, whether it's a lopsided ball, or we used to take a shingle and cut it out, and that was our gun that we played Indians and cowboys with. We didn't have any pop pistols or anything. We just cut the gun, bang, bang, and that sort of thing. You realize it, and that life is good without all the fancy amenities that we have today.
So take a trip back into time and see what Sanibel was like in the early days. Visit the Sanibel Historical Village and Museum, located next to City Hall on Dunlop Road. It's open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 4.